Thanks everyone, and thanks for your patience. My name is Karen Ferguson, and on behalf of the graduate program in urban studies and the city program at Simon Fraser University, I'd like to welcome you to the second talk in our year-long speaker series, Making Space, Contesting the City. This series is part of the initiative in urban sustainable development, which is generously funded by an endowment from the Real Estate Foundation of British Columbia and the Fraser Valley Real Estate Board. I'm particularly happy and excited to introduce you to Jill Grant, our speaker tonight. I'm not an urban planner, but as an urban studies faculty member, I teach lots of students who are, and who are hoping through their graduate studies to gain a critical perspective on their professional practice and the planning and development processes that they encounter every day at work. Whenever I assign a Jill Grant article, class discussion lights up as students recognize the planning scenarios in which they find themselves and experience epiphanies of understanding why things work or don't work as they do. So on behalf of all of us, thank you very much, Jill. Jill Grant is one of the foremost scholars of urban planning in Canada. She is a professor in the School of Planning at Dalhousie University in Halifax, where she's also served as the school's director. Dr. Grant's myriad publications and research projects examine topics like coordinating multiple plans, planning suburbs, the influence of new urbanism on Canadian planning practice, gated communities in Canada, and neighborhood change. But as her website puts it, above all, she's interested in the connections and tensions between planning and theory. Planning in theory and in practice, which, as many in our audience today know, sums up planning's central challenge. After Professor Grant's talk, we've asked a distinguished practicing planner to respond in terms of our local context. Don Limas is the manager of community planning for the city of Surrey. Before that, he filled a similar role at the city of Abbotsford, where he was responsible for the preparation of an award-winning official community plan for the city. All of this is to say is that he's the perfect person to discuss suburban planning in our region and to respond to Jill Grant's talk. He's also held faculty positions in landscape architecture at Penn State University and at UBC. One final announcement. After the formal proceedings are over this evening, I invite all of you to a reception in the mezzanine where the discussion can continue. So with no further ado, I will turn the mic over to Jill Grant, who will be talking to us tonight about making suburban space. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Karen, and thank you all for coming. Can I speak without a microphone? Can you hear me okay? Okay, good. Because I like to move around while I'm talking, so that gives me the latitude to do that. You can see the three questions that I thought I would use to guide my discussion with you tonight, focusing on questions related to what we think about the suburbs. Suburbs are places that planners especially love to hate, even though a lot of us live in suburban areas and have, at some point or another, had some kind of experience with suburban areas, that they're the kind of places that sometimes people think are pretty problematic. Let's put it nicely, problematic. But they're changing places, so I want to talk to you about some of the ways in which they're changing, and I want to talk about some of the ways in which they're contested. I see the microphones are on, even though I'm not standing near it. That's okay. So that's what I'm going to talk to you about today. And you can see from some of the images that I've put up on the slide, some of them are from this neighborhood. They're not far from here. That there's a lot of variety in what we see in Canadian suburbs. There was a time when we thought the suburbs were pretty easy to describe and predict, but they aren't as predictable anymore. They're highly varied spaces, they're diverse spaces, and they're places that we fight about in many ways. I think we have a long history of not necessarily thinking of the suburbs as very desirable or attractive spaces. The advertisement that you can see here on the slide is from a billboard advertisement that appeared in Halifax some years ago, in which the advertising company thought it was good to advertise downtown by making fun of the suburbs. This one says the suburbs are icky. Another one said the suburbs have cooties. Various plays on the things that we think of as problematic in the suburbs. The suburbs are often blamed for problems in society, whether it's youth who don't have anything to do, or inefficiency from the point of view of what we think of about in planning, that they're not places that are easy to service with transit and other things. They are places of great amount of personal debt, and they've been blamed in recent years for obesity and poor health outcomes, linked in some ways with things such as climate change. So many things that we blame the suburbs for. And yet if we think about the history of the suburbs, we know that the suburbs started out in the early 20th century as being seen as solutions, as being seen as the way in which you could solve the problems of the industrial city, the problems of congestion, of poor health, of lack of social mobility and opportunity. All of those kinds of things in the early days of the 20th century were seen as what the suburbs could resolve. And so, as Becky Nicolaitis has said, the suburbs went from being seen as the solution to urban problems to being defined as the root of urban problems during the course of the 20th century. Certain kinds of visions underlie our notion of what suburban spaces are about. And I think what we see in some of the research that we've been doing in recent years is that there are contrasting visions of what the suburbs are. Many people still hold that there's a kind of Canadian dream, especially in parts of the country where housing is more affordable than it is in a place like the Vancouver region. It's possible for households to think about the potential of owning a home with a yard, a place where children can play, and that is seen as being something desirable in many parts of the country. However, we also see people with visions of the suburbs as urban villages or as places with new city centers, as we're in here in Surrey. The idea that suburbs can potentially be more urbanized through various kinds of changes. So I think we see in many ways that suburban areas are the leading edge of our city, not just in the geographic sense, that is, that they're the edge of the city as it grows larger and moves into areas that previously were not urbanized, but it's also an area where a lot of innovation occurs in terms of urban form, in the kinds of spatial and social arrangements that are occurring in society. And so we see a lot of diversity, everything from the conventional suburb that you can see up here through urban villages, and then hybrid forms where there's a kind of combination of those elements occurring. Lots of diversity is happening. It's become increasingly difficult to know whether the suburbs are places of homogeneity and affluence, as the kind of common description of suburbs a decade or two ago would have been that they were the places where you find affluent folks often living in, and a lot of commonality amongst the kind of people there. However, if you look at suburbs across the country today, and especially in the largest cities, what we see is that suburbs are places of diversity, places of increasing polarization. The kind of social polarization that is happening in the urban center is happening in our suburban districts as well. So the suburbs are not so different than other parts of the city in some of the kinds of issues that they're dealing with in contemporary times. Certainly, lots of folks would argue that the suburbs provide habitat for the majority of Canadians. In many cities, the preponderance of the population is in suburban areas, and people like David Gordon at Queen's have done studies that argue that somewhere in the vicinity of 60 to 70% of Canadians live in areas that he would define as suburban in some ways or another. So there's lots of variation, everything from the very affluent kinds of communities that you might see in some parts of the country to very modest homes in small suburban areas in other places in the country. Since the 1990s, we've seen a lot of changes in the kinds of principles that are being used in planning and designing suburban areas. When I first started following some of the trends in Canadian suburban development, new urbanism was a new idea in this country, and it was really not being taken up in to any great extent in suburban areas. But if you look at what's going on in suburban areas today, find new urbanism principles are very strongly being implemented in development there, that certain ideas, there's a certain amount of cherry picking that goes on in terms of the ideas that are being implemented, but efforts to get greater density, to have more mix of uses, mix of housing types, to plan extensively for mass transportation systems to be part of the development. All of those kinds of things are certainly happening. And there's a lot of new kinds of forms coming up. So mixed live-work units of the kind that you can see on the left here in Markham, where the ground orientation is intended to be a work unit with living spaces above. Those are appearing in many cities. And then you find some very unusual ideas in some parts of the country. So in the center here, you can see an advertisement from Barrie in Ontario, where you got bungalofts. I'm not quite sure what a bungaloft is. It seems like a contradiction in terms, since one thinks of a bungalow as a one-story dwelling, but somehow they've managed to stick a loft into it, or at least call something that they're marketing a bungalow. So very unusual kinds of ideas. And then in some places you see things like cottages that look like they belong in a resort community appearing in the suburbs of landlocked communities such as Waterloo, Ontario. So quite a lot of innovation going on in terms of urban forms as the development industry looks for ways to add cachet and appeal to buyers who are increasingly interested in different kinds of opportunities. In some jurisdictions, of course, legislation has encouraged greater density, greater mix of use, other things going on. So in Ontario, for example, the growth legislation has created a context in which more intensification is occurring. Here in BC, you've got the Agricultural Land Reserve that has encouraged a great deal of focus in terms of what's going on and where development can and can't occur. So across the country, we're seeing a move towards greater densities than we saw a decade or two ago. A lot more high-rise housing appearing in suburban areas in various parts of the country, especially those that are growing quickly. Some of the landscaping practices make suburban areas look much more urban than they did 2 decades ago, where the houses are being brought closer to the street. They have more an urban feel to them. So there's a lot of changes going on. In slow growth parts of the country, however, areas where there's not the same kind of growth pressures that you see here in the lower mainland, then some of the conventional development principles are proving much more resistant to change. In some of those communities, where the growth is slow or the communities are smaller, then we still see conventional development patterns hanging on with the larger setbacks and lower densities, large lots, and so on. But in parts of the country where growth is occurring quickly or being managed in some ways, then we're tending to see new patterns starting to emerge. So the patterns that are coming there are increasingly influenced by new urbanism, but at the same time, comprehensive new urbanism communities have remained relatively rare. There aren't a lot of communities that are comprehensively master planned as new urbanist style communities. And by new urbanist, I mean communities that are compact, mixed use, mixed housing type, using often neo-traditional architectural styles with open space systems planned in and all the bells and whistles that one would associate with the work of people like Andres Duany. So we did a study a few years ago trying to document how many complete and comprehensive new urbanism communities we could find in Canada, and we were able to locate 42 at that point in time. I think we did that survey in 2008. So it's a relatively small number of communities, largest proportion of them being in Ontario, and a small number in BC and so on. You can see some of the provinces didn't have any that met the criteria. We do see some cities established, especially suburban municipalities like Markham, Ontario, and Surrey here, with large neighborhoods that are built according to new urbanism principles, so that there's a certain amount of infill and retrofitting going on in some areas with new urbanism principles. But by and large, it has remained a relatively small proportion of the developments in the country. We do see that some of the architectural trends that new urbanism brought to the fore have become popular in many parts of the country. So there's lots of neo-traditional architectural styles out there in the suburban landscape, but they're competing with a number of other architectural styles that are equally prevalent. Everything from the garage house of the kind that you see in this image in the center from Calgary, but you can find the same kind of house in many parts of the country. Resort style communities, which you see, especially in places like the Okanagan area here, you might see those kind of resort style communities. And then you've got some places where you get very skinny houses. See some in North York here in the bottom left, and then suburban townhouses where you've got the garages and townhouses over them. So that some of these kinds of styles are becoming increasingly prevalent, and we do see the same kind of structures being used in developments across the country. So it's not unusual to see a building in one part of the country and see something extremely similar to it in some other part of the country. So homogenization of suburban areas has certainly not stopped, even with this proliferation of styles. It's just that these styles are occurring in many parts of the country. We have documented in some of our research the widespread development of gated communities. We did another inventory in March 2004, where we were trying to document how many gated communities we could find in Canada, and in a 4-month period we were able to find 314. And by gated communities, I mean communities with a working gate across the road that enters into the community. And you can see that the largest proportion of those gated communities are here in British Columbia, many of them in the southern mainland, the Okanagan, and on Vancouver Island. So when you compare this, of course, I think I showed you 42 new urbanism communities in Canada, 314, which we estimated was maybe 1/3 of what actually exists, because they're hard to track down unless you get on the ground and you drive around neighborhoods looking for them. So that even though new urbanism has become part of the catalog of planning principles that practitioners are using today, new urbanism communities have not taken off and become the most common kind of developments in the country. They're outnumbered by a large proportion by gated communities. Private streets. I see Andrew Curran here in the back, who worked with me on this research on gated communities and private streets many years ago. We were able to look at the proliferation of private streets in this country, and that's largely connected with the condominium and strata development. Ground-oriented housing, townhouses and other units that are being built in large-scale mass planned unit developments where the entries to the condominium development are gated. So one of the things that we found as we documented some of these communities, this one's in Langley, was that they create a very fragmented street network. So I don't know if you can quite see, I put a little blue star in this graphic that Andrew made many years ago, right there, that if you have a kid that lives in this on this side and a kid that lives on this side, in order to get there, they got to go all the way around or around to the street to get in, because the fences are everywhere around these kinds of projects, and it fragments large blocks of the suburban landscape. So even in a context where we may have plans that talk about connected streetscapes, connected grid layouts and street networks, because the size of the blocks that are being created by condominium developments, where the entire lot owned by the project is quite large, once the streets get gated, then the urban fabric is quite fragmented. And signage, private street signs and other things are extensively used to try to deter people from entering these communities. So we have a very privatized landscape, especially in certain parts of the country where private and gated communities are very widespread. So, all of these indicate the kind of contrasts and contradictions that we see in suburban areas. There's no single pattern that's in use there. On the one hand, we have plans that talk about complete communities. So planners often write in our plans that we want to be able to achieve complete communities where there's space for everyone, where there's a mix of uses, where it's possible for people to live lives on foot instead of having to use their car, where you can live from the time when you are just trying to get into the housing market until you're ready to go into a senior's residence without having to leave the community. There's opportunities for all of it. That's what we think of as complete communities, and as planners, that's what we write about, what we try to achieve. On the other hand, when we look at practice of what's actually happening in our suburban landscapes, what we see is increasing evidence of polarization, of fragmentation, and continuing segregation of housing types and other things. So we're trying to understand how it is we can account for some of these contradictions and problems that planners are dealing with. With a graduate student in recent years, we were looking at this discourse around complete communities. What exactly do we mean as planners when we're talking about complete communities? And certainly the idea of complete communities is a discourse of inclusion. So you can see in the Places to Grow legislation I've excerpted here on the slide that the plan talks about building complete communities. that are well designed, offer transportation choices, accommodate people at all stages of their life, and have the right mix of housing, jobs, and access to stores and services. So that's the kind of ideal. And how is it as planners we try to achieve that? As we looked at the discourse that we were examining and trying to understand this interest in complete communities, we looked at plans, we looked at interview transcripts that we had done over recent years with planners in many parts of the country. And we tried to understand what is it we think we're trying to do and achieve in trying to produce complete communities. What we created to account for what we were seeing in the research that we were doing is this little diagram that you can see on the right here, which is, I don't know if any of you would have read many years ago, there's a book by Constance Perrin called Everything in Its Place, where in the 1970s she looked at the American housing industry and tried to understand how players in that industry constructed the notion of what it was they were trying to serve in building and financing development in the suburbs. And what she found was they had this certain kind of model about the family and about how suburbs should work. And it boiled down to this notion of everything in its place, that the idea is you kind of work through a ladder of accomplishment in your life. You start out as a renter and you hope to move up to be an owner. And all of those things in her model were linked to childbearing and other kinds of life transitions. What we found is that there's a certain kind of model that still exists in the ideas that people use in planning and building and inhabiting the suburbs. And that model has become more elaborate since the time when Constance Perrin was writing about what was going on in suburban development, but it hasn't completely disappeared. And so you can see the model here. And it assumes that when you're young and single, that you are getting into the housing market in a condo, but it's an entry-level condo. And then as you form a couple and you move towards having children, then your idea is moving up the housing ladder, getting more space. Maybe you move into a townhouse, you move into a small detached house. And then one of the people we interviewed, a counselor in Alberta, gave us a kind of a long discourse about this and talked about when you make it really big, then you can buy your house on the top of the hill. It's kind of, the highlight of your life is you make it so big that you can get this big house and kind of look down on the rest of the world. But then we've elaborated that ladder so that that's not the end of it anymore. Now the idea is that you at some point move on. You become an empty nester and then you move on into smaller units, but now you're on the luxury side of the ladder. So yeah, you're coming down the ladder in terms of size and so on, but you're moving up in some notion of luxury. And so this kind of model has become part of the way that we think about delivering housing in the suburbs. So the assumptions that many in the practice of planning in the whole market is that housing is no longer a kind of something that you move into and you inhabit for your life and you kind of stay there until the end. Now it's a commodity, it's a consumable. It's something you go into not as a kind of home, but as an investment, as something that you are building equity through. So it's a very different, in our suburbs reflect this, that we have a very different idea of what housing is today than we did 20 years ago when we were talking to people about their assumptions of what they're doing in their lives. And so things have become, in many ways, more complicated. This the discussion about polarization that we have looked at it in some of our research is really trying to identify what I suggest here are some kind of quiet truths about difference. That although we have a discourse that talks about diversity, what we see happening in the suburbs in many instances is that difference is not as well accommodated as we might like to think that it is. So that even in some of our most diverse communities, diverse suburban communities, we still see high levels of segregation. So what I have up here, this map, is from a paper that we did looking at Markham in Ontario, which I did with Catherine Perrott. And there we were looking at, Markham is often described as the most diverse community in Canada because it has a very high proportion of visible minority residents, a very high proportion of people born outside Canada, people speaking different first languages, similar to Surrey in many ways in terms of the high levels of diversity. But even in the 2001-2006 censuses, it was very, very high, the highest in the country. So we wanted to look at what was going on in Surrey to get a sense of, is this a success? Is this an indication of success in policy? Because Markham is one of the communities where no urbanism principles came in very early on and where they've been planning to try to achieve higher densities and mixes and so on. But what we found when we looked at it more closely was that it's hard to know whether you see this entirely as a success story about diversity, because what is happening on the ground in Markham is a new kind of segregation occurring. And I don't know how well you can see the numbers on these on this slide. This slide is identifying areas with very high proportion of visible minority. So the darkest color is let me see if I can read what it says. It's over 80% visible minority in the places with the highest, the darkest tone. So what you can see in this is that there's a lot of segregation occurring in terms of where there's concentrations, and there's a lot of the segregation is occurring not because of discrimination, but out of people's choice to create neighborhoods, to create communities where they share access to community-specific services and language services and other things, so that people are choosing to locate in particular areas. So despite the fact that we have in place planning policies that encourage integration and diversity, it's not possible to prevent people from self-selecting to create somewhat more homogeneous communities than we might have expected them to have. So that even as the level of visible minorities in the population in Markham moves up, there's a new level of segregation occurring that indicates that the difference doesn't entirely go away despite our planning policies and our efforts to integrate and create the right kind of context. So we can't generate social diversity through place diversity as perhaps we might want to try to achieve. Recent research that's being done not just in suburban areas but in urban areas by people like David Holchansky at the University of Toronto has been looking at the patterns of social polarization in Canada. And here I have one of David's slides from his research that talks about the development of what he calls 3 cities in Toronto. He looks at social change over the period from 1970 to 2005 in this particular graphic. And what it shows is that the patterns of affluence and poverty in the city are shifting. So In 1970 in Toronto, the city center was a less affluent part of the city. The suburbs were the most affluent part of Toronto. By 2005, the pattern had largely shifted so that the most affluent, the areas that had increased most in relative affluence in the city of Toronto are those blue areas, which are largely along the subway lines and down towards the lakefront in the city. So that the central parts of the city had become more affluent and the older suburban areas in the city of Toronto proper had become less affluent. And we see similar kinds of patterns occurring in many larger cities, that poverty is increasingly suburbanizing and affluence is increasingly urbanizing. There's some differences, but these kinds of patterns are occurring in many areas. We've been looking at them in Halifax as well. And you can see in this slide that the suburban areas of Dartmouth across the harbor from Halifax have been significantly decreasing in their relative affluence compared to the city as a whole over time, while inner areas in the city have become more affluent. So there's changing patterns of poverty and affluence that are going on in many of the larger cities in the country as some of the recent changes occur. When we look at suburban areas more specifically, even though we're often master planning those suburban areas to try to ensure that there's place diversity and mix of uses, mix of housing types, mix of incomes in those neighborhoods, when we look at communities in detail, we often find patterns of segregation that are still managing to come through. So you can see in this image that is illustrated on the right that although the project as a whole is a mix and has a range of housing types and price points and so on, that when you look at the details of the development, what you often find are pockets, that things are much more concentrated spatially within the project than one would be led to believe. So there may be a street of townhouses somewhere and a street of detached houses somewhere else. They're not mixed together on the same street in most suburban areas. And even in many of the downtown projects that are done, some of the students took me on a tour this morning to the Woodwards project, where even though that's a mixed use project, each of the uses are in separate buildings. So that this notion we have that we're trying to achieve mix and we're trying to achieve integration is proving much more challenging in practice than we had hoped it would, because the market finds ways to continue to segregate these things in discrete pods and on different streets, and separating things out with other structures and open space and so on. So why are these challenges there? Well, implementation is not easy. Trying to implement these ideas runs into barriers around political commitment. Political commitments to change vary. In some places, political leaders are very committed to changes. In other places, they're not as committed. They turn over with some regularity as well. Elections every few years. So even if they make a commitment, it's hard to sustain that commitment over the length of time that it takes to change the way we do business in our communities. Local economic conditions vary widely. So what you can achieve in places that are growing very quickly, whereas as planners and political leaders, you have a significant amount of clout with potential developers because they can see the need to get projects approved quickly. That kind of clout doesn't exist in every community. We've got communities, I put up here St. Thomas, Ontario, where most of the major employers have gone out of business or have closed down factories in recent years. It's very hard for local officials to have any kind of clout when developers come in asking for permission. So the ability to manage and influence the kinds of outcomes varies widely, and that affects the potential for innovation. Sometimes the market presents a real challenge to us in trying to implement ideas. So as planners, we've been interested for many years in mixed use, the idea of creating places where people can walk to the store, they can walk to work and walk to school and so on. It's difficult to achieve some of those things, in part because there are issues of scale at work. So it's very hard to make retail work in mixed-use development. There's a surplus in many communities, there's a surfeit of retail space. And so if you're trying to create a context in which you want to require developers to put ground floor retail in, chances are reasonably good that some of that ground floor retail is not going to get occupied for a long period of time. So you see a lot of vacant space in many communities. And it's partly perhaps because as practitioners we're thinking long term and thinking that over the long term that space will become viable commercial space. But it makes it very hard for developers to put out projects where they can't lease space for many years. It undermines the residents' belief that the planners were being honest with them, that this was, or the people selling them units were being honest, that there was going to be a nice cafe in that space. And so we see examples across the country where that retail space has not been able to maintain its viability, and that's a real challenge. Part of it has to do with understanding also the way consumers behave. That frankly, it's challenging to get people out of their cars. So I put up some figures about the proportion of workers who commute to work by vehicle, and it's not that the numbers are not dissimilar even in communities where there's very good public transportation systems, or where there's extensive new urbanism principles with lots of opportunities for retail locally. People still choose to use their cars and go shopping in the big shopping centers rather than in the little local retail. We can't underestimate the fear that people have about difference. That although as a society we talk about multiculturalism and we like to think of ourselves as good-natured and open and tolerant, that when you start to look in detail at how people talk about spaces, we see that there is resistance in communities to having people who are very different than you in your household in the neighborhood. So here I have a few examples that I put up on this slide. A planner in Calgary who explained that you never put townhouses, semis, and singles in the same cell. The market wouldn't buy it. So the problem for the development industry is that they need to be able to sell units. They need to be able to sell them in a timely way so that they're not sitting on their investment for a long period of time. And if they if they put too much mix in, then it delays the rate at which the market will absorb those units. And so that's a losing proposition for developers, and planners in the Calgary example here recognize that. In the bottom corner is one from a resident in Barrie we interviewed in 2010, who said, it just doesn't work when you try to put multifamily in with single detached housing. You've got the townhouse units that are always separate no matter where you put them. And what they meant by that was that they're socially separate. They don't, some of the residents we interviewed in Barrie were so explicit as to say, I wouldn't let my kids play with them, with kids in those units. So there's a sense of difference that people continue to experience from the notion back to that little ladder of housing that I told you that suggests that somehow when you go into different kinds of units, it indicates a transition in your success in life and in your place in the world that people take fairly seriously. And then we have a counselor in Markham who says, there's a lot of townhouses. You end up with a lot of single family, then you get bigger single family. There's options there. People will tell you there's not as many as there should be, but you have to ask yourself what you want your community to be. I didn't move to Markham from downtown Toronto because I wanted to move into a community where there was a great mix of housing, because I thought I was moving up in the world. So you can see from that the way in which people see this notion of, you're going into different kind of housing because you're going somewhere in the world, and mix undermines that perception of self and identity and life trajectory that people have. When we look at suburban space, we see that it's highly contested, and it is contested on many different levels. Power is not evenly distributed in how the suburbs get built. Some folks have power in making decisions about how the suburbs get built, and other people have less power. And some years ago, when I was looking at the various interviews we had done in different communities across the country as part of the research, I was writing a paper on something, and I started to notice as I was going through transcripts that there were a lot of what I call pugilistic metaphors coming out. So when people were talking about what was going on in their community, they weren't just describing things in neutral ways. They were using very expressive terms that were related to fighting. So I put a few examples up here. Hold the line. And we fought the battle of design issues. Fighting to stop everything. We stuck to our guns. We threw in the towel. And we fight that all the time. So these are just some examples of these kind of pugilistic metaphors that people use. And so I decided to analyze them systematically in the data that we had. And when I went through and analyzed them systematically, I could see that they were being used in different ways in different communities. So in some communities, it was the planners who were using fight metaphors to indicate that they won the fight. And in other communities, planners were using the metaphors in ways that indicated they lost the fight. They couldn't win the battle, and so on. And so what we see in these kinds of discourse is that in some communities, planners feel less empowered than they feel in other communities. In some communities, there is political support for trying to make a different kind of community. And in other communities, there isn't the kind of political support that planners need to actually be able to implement some of the ideas that they have about how to improve suburban form. So there's a lot of variation there in those power relationships that indicate how contested the space is, and that helps us to understand why in some cases implementation of ideas fail. all of this boils down to say that the battles about density, battles about changing the shapes of our suburban landscapes are ultimately, in many ways, battles about difference, battles about identity. They reflect the way in which people are changing in our communities. They reflect fears that people have about change in their communities. So people worry about things like parking problems, that if there's a lot of more density coming into their communities, they worry about parking. But you can see in the illustration here that sometimes that language is also couched in terms of ethnic communities, particular ethnic communities who are perceived to live in different ways in neighborhoods. Ultimately, one planner in Halifax put it well, that said, people like some things about density. They like the idea of shops in their neighborhoods and all that stuff, but they just don't want all the people that would come along with that in order to make that happen. And so there's still a lot of resistance to that, those kinds of changes. So we've kind of theorized around this issue of trying to understand what it is that people want and don't want, and came up with this idea of differentiating diversity and difference in this way, that people generally talk about diversity as a good thing, whether we're talking about to planners or residents or developers. Everybody loves diversity. They love ethnic food, festivals, all that kind of stuff. And yet they worry about difference. They worry about different kinds of behaviors, people using space in different ways. And a lot of this, this perception, this kind of fear of difference, I think, in some ways is supporting the move towards master plan communities. That one of the things that residents of master planned communities like about master planned communities is that they control for a lot of difference. They regulate the way in which the community works. They regulate whether people can paint things particular colors or put stuff out in their front yard, or where they have to park their cars and so on. People appreciate that kind of regulation and control because I think in large part they see it as managing certain things that come along with difference that they don't like so much. There's also, I think, a sense that we see in some of the interviews that that some of the presumptions we make as planners are not necessarily borne out in the way people talk about the way they live their lives. So we've tended as planners to believe that people want to be sociable, that they want places where they can interact with their neighbors and form a strong sense of community. But some of the people we interview, like this resident we interviewed in Halifax, said, I don't need any new friends. Like, I didn't move into this community to make friends. I already have friends. And they don't want somebody knocking on their door every morning. So I think we also have to start to think about how do we understand the way that people live their lives today? That there's less and less sociability for many people, or a different kind of sociability, where people are connecting with their friends and loved ones through social media and other things, and not perhaps interested in engaging with the community that they are living around as they move. And especially in this context where this notion of housing is kind of a ladder. You're not staying in a place and making a community forever in that kind of a concept. You're just there for a few years, building equity until you move on to the next stage in that model. So there's a lot of changes going on in terms of how people live their lives in these spaces that contribute to some of the challenges of implementing ideas. So, what will the future bring for the suburbs? Well, there's, the optimistic scenarios would probably argue that we're going to move towards more sustainable, healthy, complete communities. We're making policies that certainly head towards that aim of more diverse and affordable and so on. I think that there's many places where we can see improvement toward those aims and some successful examples of beautiful communities that achieve that. On the other hand, there's a lot of folks who might say, well, there's not going to be a lot of change quickly. We're going to probably see a lot of car-oriented development continue for the near term. There's no sign that that is disappearing in many parts of the country. Some scenarios, some recent books have argued that the suburbs are likely to change quite dramatically. That, for example, in the United States, a lot of suburban areas were hit very hard by the recent economic meltdown, so that you have large suburban districts that went through foreclosures and other problems, a lot of abandoned units, abandoned development projects. So people like Lineberger and Nelson arguing that people are going to give up on the suburbs, that we'll see a re-urbanization, and that suburban housing is likely to devalue and diminish in its popularity. So that's certainly a possible, if pessimistic, scenario. There's certainly worrying signs in many suburban areas, very high level of debt. This map gives you, it's a debt map for Halifax, the central part of Halifax. The darker the color, the higher the debt load households are carrying. Alan Walks has been mapping these debtscapes, he calls them, for Canadian cities, and Vancouver's is much worse than Halifax. But you can see here that the debt loads are higher in suburban areas. Households are carrying high levels of debt. So this is a significant problem for the future, obviously for the future of our communities, and as the baby boomer generation passes into oblivion, there's a potential for a large number of units to come onto the market and for changes to happen in suburban areas. So I think that when we look at the suburbs, what we can say is that they really reflect what we are as a society. They are places where we negotiate who we are, how we live, what we want our identity to be, where we express cultural preferences and our ideas about ourselves and each other, and our need to belong. They are the kinds of places where we live our lives and express that. So, not surprisingly, all of the kinds of contradictions that are part of contemporary life are expressed in the suburbs. So they have all of the ills and the potential benefits that any part of the city has. And I've only had time tonight to touch on some of the issues that they represent, but there are certainly places where we can see some of contemporary notions about what the city is and what we are as citizens in the city being expressed and contested on a daily basis. So I thank you very much for your attention, and I'm happy to take questions after Dawn gives a few comments. Thank you.
So I've never done this before, being a discussant, I guess is the term, but very happy to do so tonight. So I've been asked to respond, Jill, to your talk, and perhaps also to give some local flavor or some local reflections on the national issues that you've brought up, and also to begin the dialogue. And I think that's the most important thing. Is I think everybody in this room has direct experience with the things that Jill has talked about tonight, and we're hoping that we can get some good dialogue. So first of all, a confession. As someone who has lived most of his life and has spent most of his professional career in the suburbs, I hope that I'll resist my tendency to get a little defensive about the burbs in my comments, but whatever. First, Jill, I want to express my appreciation for your really nuanced, careful, and serious scholarship around suburbs. I think the list of academics who take the suburbs very seriously and look very closely at the forces and forms that they exhibit, that list is short. And I really thank you for it. And your work, as I've dipped into it in preparation for tonight, is actually tremendously useful to practicing planners in places like Surrey. So thank you very much for your record of scholarship and for your talk tonight. Because I think actually that the difficult work of transforming suburbs from monotonous and car-dominated spaces to more complex, more diverse, more walkable places is tremendously important and interesting. To paraphrase my friend and colleague Patrick Condon at UBC, he's always fond of saying that the battle for sustainability will be won or lost in the suburbs. So I think it is really important work and important scholarship. But I guess I'm an optimist on your scale of optimism or pessimism. I think there's some positive signs in terms of the ways in which suburban communities have been transformed in Canada and certainly in this region. But I would say, and I'm guessing, Jill, that you might agree, that the terms suburb and suburban are increasingly unsatisfactory and inadequate to describe the increasingly complex urban morphology, built form, and demography of places like Surrey or Richmond or Langley or Coquitlam or Markham in the Metro Vancouver region for sure. And just as you've pointed out, the suburbs are not monolithic. Surrey certainly is not monolithic. They're they're highly urban places and very rural places. So I think it's inadequate to describe these diverse places with this blanket term, the suburbs. But we don't have an adequate term to replace that with. And I'm wondering, one question I have for you, Jill, is what could be a term or a group of terms that could replace this, I think, inadequate and unsatisfying term, the suburbs? Because the term suburb carries with it pejorative overtones, I think. It's suburban, less than urban, supportive of urban, but not real urban. And as you point out, it's a shorthand in the media and the public mind for xenophobia, monoculture, sprawl, boredom, youth crime, and now obesity. It's like the veritable list of 7 deadly sins of the 21st century. But the term suburbs is not inclusive of some of the good things that you'll find in a place like Surrey. Salmon-bearing streams running directly through neighborhoods that haven't been ditched and culverted as they have been in other places. A significant local food production, real farmers. Vibrant ethnic neighborhoods that are new and interesting. Affordable and innovative forms of housing to meet the different needs of different family structures that of immigrant communities and other Canadians that temper the list of woes that you had early on. So I think we need a new term to describe these places that are not burdened by the stereotypes of the word suburb. One of the favorite things for me, one of my favorite things is to take friends of mine who are city-born and bred, urbanists, to places in Surrey and tour them to places that confound their expectations of what the suburbs they think should be or are. But I think in some ways the challenge of conceptualizing and appreciating suburban spaces is their unfinished nature. It's the nature of new communities to be unfinished. And there's often a ragged weave and a loose structure to urban development in peripheral urban municipalities that is a consequence of their explosive growth during the era of cheap personal transportation. Jill, you were right on about this complete community rhetoric and the slow pace at which that is actually borne out in reality. We're starting to see in some neighborhoods where we explicitly designed them to be mixed use. We're starting to see the corner stores start to come, but 10, 15 years after many people have been living there. And it's unsatisfying for the first wave of residents to live in what was supposed to be a mixed community. But it comes. And some of the newness of the suburbs and the loose weave of the suburbs is part of what it is burdened with, I think. But the thing, I think, of many things in your talk, and I could go in many directions, certainly the whole private community, gated community thing is tremendously interesting. But the thing I think that resonated for me the most in your talk was your comment that implementing change is difficult. And I think there are many of us in the room here for whom that's their daily business, is trying to implement this kind of change. And it is difficult. It can feel very elusive, and I think there's been lots of missed opportunities and backward steps certainly in Surrey along the way. But I've come to the conclusion that down on the ground where planners operate as advisors of council, as referees in the development wars between neighborhood groups and developers, and as negotiators across the table from well-connected developers, that the big forces, the real big things that have actually generated the suburban world that we operate in are beyond our control. These big forces like market demand and lenders' risk tolerance for financing certain kinds of projects, cultural attitudes about what constitutes quality of life, and the very strong interest in private property value and equity building. These are big forces. Or lagging transit investment and service delivery, which is a big issue here in Surrey. These are beyond the control of individual planners. But paradoxically, I think that some things are within our control, or at least within our influence. And sometimes getting these key little things consistently right can over time shift those big forces that are necessary to actually transform communities. Things like grain. What I talk about there is the fine grain of urban development. The worst example, worst, I shouldn't say that. The most stereotypically suburban examples that you've shown are very coarse-grained communities, where it's a mile to the next intersection, and there's a huge pod of development, all of the same kind of housing, or a big regional shopping center or strip malls. One thing that we can do at the ground level is start to break up that grain, create a finer grain. We do it in Surrey. Certainly our colleagues in transportation engineering planning have been the leaders on this, but planning is starting to come along, of breaking down townhouse complexes, single-family neighborhoods into a finer grain of walkable streets and blocks. That's a hard fight. Developers don't like giving up land for free. They don't like it. But we think that it's important to do it. But we could do a lot more. Jill, I think you talked about the grain of diversity and how even within a supposedly mixed income, mixed housing type community, you've got little pods of sameness. I don't know if that's a problem or not. I'm not sure. But certainly we could go further in terms of requiring diversity at that granular scale, or perhaps reviewing our policy on requiring large land assembly for certain kinds of projects to proceed, or incentivizing mixed-use buildings or fee-simple row houses. The second one is address, which is how buildings address the street. And I think in Surrey we do push hard for active facades of buildings directly fronting public parks, public streets and greenways, to eliminate this buffer mentality that's still so prevalent in the suburbs. See, I'm doing it myself in suburban and urbanizing communities, I should say. Of creating separation between buildings and streets through landscaping strips, through parking lots, turning our back on the public realm and the public street. That's something we can do at the ground level. And the third is friction, of designing streets and requiring and developing street standards and street sections that prioritize pedestrians, that permit or even require on-street parking, even on arterials, even in busy commercial sections of our city. I think that's super important. So getting these little things consistently right over time, I think, can lead to a greater appetite for more urbane development among the community, can create local precedents that you can point to and say, see, it works. The world didn't fall apart. You can point to a precedent for a developer or for a local neighborhood that's resisting change, and can demonstrate the conditions that could perhaps even hasten the delivery of transit investments at the regional level. So finally, Jill, I'd like to hear your thoughts on these strategies or tactics, I guess. But also I think I'd like to hear more from you about mix, about the desirability of mix of all kinds, and whether whether that's a realistic goal that we have in our planning documents, or whether we should think differently about it. I'd like to hear your thoughts on those things. So anyway, I had some other thoughts, but I'll leave it at that. I was tremendously stimulated by your talk, Jill, and it raises so many issues around moving our cities to become more sustainable, livable, and to support people to live healthy, rich, and meaningful lives, even in the suburbs. So.
I'll ask Dawn and Jill to take a seat at the front here, and maybe, Jill, if you'd like to respond to Dawn, and then we'll open it up to the audience.
Okay. Thank you very much for your comments, Dawn. The question about mix, I guess I'll start there, because I think it's a complicated one. I think the idea of mix is a good idea, but the challenge is to figure out how to do it in a marketplace that's not always very receptive to the idea, because frankly I'm not sure that it's a great idea to impose certain kinds of notions of mix on a development if it only makes it problematic to market the project. And so when I see in many places the retail space remaining vacant for a long period of time in a project, I think that's really a problem for the community as well as for the developer and so on. So yep, it may be that in 15 or 20 years there'll be something going in there, but it won't have fulfilled the function. Like the really important function is to help that community get started and so on. So I'm not sure how to address the need for that, because I think that there's certainly an argument to be made that communities benefit from having mixed use around. But I think one of the good ideas that comes with some of the live work projects is that some of them have decided to be much more flexible in terms of what can go in there, so that you can retain the possibility that it can be commercial at some point in time, but that you don't insist that it start out that way. Because if a community starts out with a lot of vacant space on the street, it kind of establishes a tone for the neighborhood, which is not positive for the people in there either. So finding ways to be able to let that space be flexible and adaptable as the community grows and changes, then I think that's perhaps this kind of strategy that you can use. If I might just answer your comment about the term suburbs too. Andres Duaney is very fond of insisting that, you put suburbs in brackets, which is kind of why I don't know if it's on this. Yeah, I kind of purposely did that, because it's the critics of the suburbs love to do that, to say it's a it's somehow suburban, and I've been teaching about the suburbs for a long time and researching them, and so I love the suburbs because I find them really fascinating, even when I don't necessarily like what I see there, and I think that it's the wrong approach. I think that my approach to thinking about the suburbs is that they're just transitional. They're transitional spaces. They're the leading edge of the city. As the city grows, it's got an area starts and it changes over time. So if you look at the suburbs of the early 20th century, now we don't think of them as suburbs anymore. We just think of them as old neighborhoods in the city. And that's what these areas become over time. So I'm not so troubled about the idea of calling them suburbs, because I think of it as a stage of urbanization. And I think that in the current period, we've finally gotten to the situation where, as planners, we have begun to develop policy that lets that leading edge of the city start out in a way that transitions to urban more easily and more effectively than we did for a while in the 20th century, when we had a notion that the suburbs were going to solve problems of the city. So I think that, I wouldn't say we need a different term. I just think we need to stop seeing the term suburban as pejorative. Rescue it from its...
Redeem it.
Yeah.
So let's open it up to the audience. And, I know it's kind of annoying, but if you could go to one of the mics, that would be great, because we're trying to preserve this for posterity. So, yeah. So are there any questions? Thanks.
Could have given you my mic, yeah.
That's true. I guess one of my questions I had was regarding the issue of diversity and mix in suburbs, and the sort of penchant for not just suburban communities, but for urban communities to prefer developments, very large developments by a single developer, to provide the housing mix and buildings for any given community. And I'm wondering if part of the problem is that sort of agglomeration of land to build these buildings, and whether diversity and mix might come from restricting the size of developments to much smaller parcels, such that you're not expecting one developer to provide the diversity, but that you're actually injecting diversity at the development level.
It's an interesting question. Certainly, over the time that I've been following the suburbs, I've seen development companies become larger and larger, and the size of projects become larger and larger, and planners become more interested in master plan communities instead of small scale developments. And so all of the processes at work in the industry seem to be going towards larger scale. While there's obviously some benefits for that in terms of efficiency of land development and making sure you can put in all of the services and so on for a complete community, it has facilitated that process of homogenization, and it certainly, as the developers have gotten larger and they're dealing with larger scale developments, there's less internal differentiation in the market in terms of, I remember in Halifax that there was a time when there were companies that did the high end of the market and companies that did the low end of the market, and now there aren't. They all do the middle and high end of the market. And so that there's a certain kind of ecology in the development market that has moved also towards an upper end. And so as they're doing that, then because they're doing that, they're looking at ways to differentiate the pods within their development so they can keep the different, and sometimes the differences in the pods is relatively modest in terms of, they're talking about detached houses, but with 35-foot frontage and some with 40-foot frontage that they got to somehow keep separate. They're really small elements of difference that are there, but it is obviously for those trying to market those projects, they know where the resistance comes from, and they're trying to find ways to have diversity of product to be able to sell to different points in the market, but to put them together in a way that they'll move quickly. So I'm not sure if that answers your question or just elaborates on it. Hi.
Good to see you. Thanks for your talk, and Don for your comments. Those were, I think, really interesting, good compliments. I've got a thought and a question. The thought was maybe around the terminology. It's something, obviously, in our work, I work at TransLink here in the region, and it's something we struggle with quite a bit. It's a very diverse region, 21 municipalities, many regional city centers, smaller town centers, municipal centers. And as Don pointed out, I think the morphology is quite it's varied across the entire region. I think it is a bit too black and white to talk about urban and suburban. And we generally, when we say the city, we think Vancouver. And when we say the suburbs, we think every other municipality in the region outside of Vancouver. But in reality, downtown New Westminster is much more urban than all of Vancouver south of 16th. And in central Surrey and central Coquitlam are becoming much more urban places as well. So I think it might be more useful, at least in our work, I'm focused mostly on transportation planning, to think about more auto-oriented places and more pedestrian-oriented places, and that the more pedestrian and more auto-oriented places exist within every municipality in the region. And then maybe age is another sort of thing. We often talk about mature communities and newly developing communities, but it seems like those are more useful distinctions to actually be more precise. Anyhow, the question was, let's see, around, Dawn, you talked about a few of the things that were within our control as planners. And it seemed like parking ratios and street design guidelines were two big ones that you didn't mention. And I know we've talked about that in our work around the challenge of having reduced parking requirements in new developments, especially when the transit investment is lagging behind. And it might be, echoing on your comment, Jill, around the need to sort of transition some of that, the mix that we want to see up front, but might not be able to materialize in a development until 10 or 15 years down the road. It seems the same kind of thing is true with parking, and I'm wondering if either of you have thoughts on both parking and street design, sort of how those things might be able to transition over time as the community develops.
On something really important. I mean, parking is such a huge issue in Surrey. Sort of our poster child, I guess, of quote, sustainable new urbanist neighborhoods is East Clayton. And it pains me that in the local discourse, it's seen as a failure. It's seen as a failure on one aspect, and that's the shortage of parking. On a lot of other metrics, it's a very successful neighborhood, very successful community. Highest walk to school ratios by a long shot in the city. Retail and employment right mixed in, live, work, the whole bit. So parking is such a big issue, and we've wrestled with it. And one thing that we're interested in trying to figure out is, are there some transition strategies where, let's say, there's an apartment development. It's along a future transit line, but the transit's not there yet. And so for the developer to market condos in that structure, he's going to have to provide parking, or he's not going to sell the condo. Is there a way of requiring the developer to hold a portion of their property as a surface parking lot for some time, and that could be released after some period of time when transit gets to a certain predetermined threshold, and then the no build could be released? Or in a single family neighborhood where 5 lots in a 40 lot subdivision are held off the market with a no build, and there's a community parking lot on those lots, and they're released only after we're thinking about those kinds of things, because it seems a shame to overbuild parking and to underbuild development in future transit accessible locations. But getting that transition right is a real challenge.
Yeah, I can't speak to solutions for parking, but I can say that it's something that people really take seriously. They really don't like it when there's parking issues in their community, and they see everything else as a failure when it happens. And as to the point about whether suburban areas are auto-oriented, the work that David Gordon did at Queen's, he used that as his definition of suburban as he was trying to define the proportion of people that lived in suburban areas in Canada, was to link it to the commute to work, because it was very hard. He couldn't do it in terms of density or many other factors that he was trying to figure out what would make sense. So he ended up doing it based on the proportion of the population that are commuting to work in an urban center and so on. So, there are certainly people who have been working on trying to figure out what exactly does it mean to be suburban, because it's not easy to determine, and even Statistics Canada is all over the place in terms of how they've used the term.
Thank you very much for your talk. One issue that you haven't mentioned, and I wonder if you've thought about it because it's affected Halifax, but it's not affected the Lower Mainland in the same way, and that's the forced mergers, right? So that's that's has changed the place of the suburbs, right? In the sense that politically they are now part of the city and can define development. And of course in Toronto, that's been a major source of the debate, in Montreal, in Ottawa, Halifax, et cetera. And I wonder whether you've looked at all at the place of the suburbs in a merged city and what that means for development vis-a-vis the Lower Mainland, for example, where the municipalities have remained largely distinct.
Short answer is no. I haven't really gotten into the political questions of it too much. Just in Halifax, it has certainly been an issue. There's a lot of political tensions between rural, suburban, and urban councillors in terms of how to manage development in the city, and the city has reduced the number of councillors since amalgamation. It started out at one number, it's now a smaller number, in part to try to manage those different tensions. And I have a graduate student now who's working at looking at some of the issues that are related to this, not so much in terms of the suburban urban tensions, but how it affects the coordination of plans, because we have a lot of plans in Halifax. Despite the amalgamation, there's still all the lingering plans from pre-amalgamation that are trying to be managed, and some of those are covering suburban areas. And one of the problems that Halifax has experienced is that the rules are different in all these different communities, and the developers don't like it when they have to deal with different rules in different places. So those kinds of things have become an issue. And it's been hard in Halifax as well to get consensus around the need to intensify in the urban center because Halifax is a low-growth community, councillors in other parts of the area want to get growth in their suburban districts, and so there's a lot of competition for growth rather than a willingness to think about having a consistent and coherent municipal strategy. So I'm not sure if that totally answers your question, but it is an issue, I think, in many areas, is though the way in which the suburbs and the city center deal with each other politically and where the power lies.
Kind of an interesting third leg to that is there are some cities, especially in the prairies, where not amalgamation, but annexation has been the way in which they've grown. And there's some interesting studies. I think there was a study from the States, it may have been Albuquerque or Houston, one of these mega cities down there that has annexed all this land. And this author was making the argument that there's more fiscal equality in these cities that have annexed portions of their hinterland as opposed to allow them to balkanize into different municipalities. It's a really interesting question. That Three Torontos map is interesting because the outer belt, that's Rob Ford territory. Mm-hmm. It's really, really interesting because that's all brought those voters into the city of Toronto.
So great to see a presentation that had Canadian images in it. You've all seen the American version of this. And it would be great to see the book that tells us how we got to now, the differences between the American and the British or whatever our influences were. Are you planning to write that?
Not right away.
All right. But I do have one to recommend to you. Just finished, called Dead End, Benjamin Ross. Actually, it's the best thing that I've read as far as explaining how we got to now. His thesis would be that, well, it's a great line from it. We think planning is about making the city of the future. It's really about embalming the present. And because so much of the purpose of zoning in particular is to do that, embalm the present, it's about status seeking and the protection of that status. So what I'm wondering is, given 2008, the demographic change, millenniums in greater number than the boomers, that the longer that my generation holds out and tries to embalm the present, is that going to ensure that when change comes, it will be more radical?
Question. I'm not sure that I can can really answer it. I think
What do you think the long-term changes in 2008 are going to be?
Well, I think, a few years ago, I would have thought that we would have had a housing crash by now, because the stuff that I showed you from Alan Walks about the debtscape, he's been talking about that for a long time, and it's clear that the levels of debt are very high in many areas, and that the housing market is highly inflated. And so I would have thought that by now we would have probably seen some kind of a correction in that would have altered somewhat the kind of situation that we're in. I think that as the boomers pass, that we're going to see a big change, because there's likely to be a lot of housing coming on the market when that happens that may not be easily absorbed, and that the generations coming behind us don't have the same buying capacity that the boomers had as we came through the system. We came through at a time when housing prices were relatively low and wages were high, and now the opposite is true. So that raises a lot of problems. But I think it's not just for the suburbs that's a problem. It's a problem for the cities. It's going to be a problem for cities everywhere, because we got a lot of condos in the city center that are not going to not be as valued as they are now. So I think there's a lot of potential changes ahead, and I guess I'm not quite as convinced that we're embalming the city. The idea of protecting cities from change it goes back to the early days of planning, and planning has always been about, to some extent, trying to protect what people value in the city. On the other hand, planning is about coping with and accommodating changes as they're occurring. And so I think that's one of the tensions that is necessarily there in planning, is that it's trying to do both things at once. And it's part of why we run into conflict in practice, that we're trying to, both protect what we value now and make room for what we see coming. And that's not always easy to do. I think that I'm not entirely sure what is ahead, but I think that certainly the generation that follows us has to anticipate a different kind of situation as the boomers head off into whatever happens after all this is over. Yeah, that there's going to be a lot of changes in our communities that will change the way markets work. I think that's what I would predict, and so I don't know quite how they're going to handle that, because I don't think it's going to be easy. It's going to be challenging, but it'll be different kinds of challenges than we've had to deal with as we've been accommodating. For the last 50 years, the challenge of accommodating the boomers has been all this expansion. And now we have to look at figuring out what do you do as they diminish. And we're left with all of the infrastructure and the housing that has met their needs all this time. And we've kind of been forced into choices in the last decade of smaller and smaller units in higher density, because that's what people could potentially afford in the next generation. But all of a sudden there's going to be all this other housing on the market, and what is that going to do to demand? I think we need to have some pretty good futurists working on looking at the scenarios for that and thinking about how to advise planners on what will be appropriate ways of trying to deal with that. I think it probably won't hit the larger cities quite as much, because you've got constant immigration from abroad, and
migration within the country that continues to supply the demand. But in smaller cities across the country, they're already experiencing it, and it's not pretty.
I think also, Gordon, people are really adaptable, and new forms of households, new forms of housing sometimes occupy old structures. I mean, look at the single-family house in Surrey. Is there such a thing as a single-family house in the Lower Mainland? Not really. There's 2 or 3 families living in many, many structures. That's an adaptation, I guess, to cost, to different family structures, to different ethnic ways of living, cultural ways of living. So I don't know. It's going to be curious. I'll be curious to see what happens. But I guess I'm not such a pessimist. Plus, there's the biggest wealth transfer in the history of the world taking place as baby boomers pass on and give all their lucre to their kids. You got to wonder who's buying all those houses, don't you? I can't fathom it. You drive through mile after mile after mile of Greater Vancouver real estate. Every one of those houses is worth more than $1 million, and you wonder who's buying this stuff. Somebody is. Not me, but somebody is.
So we have time for one more question. Well, if not, I'd like to thank the optimist and I don't know.
I'm not a pessimist.
I'm a realist.
No, the optimist and the realist to talk about the leading edge. Thank you very much. This was very, very stimulating, both your talk and Dawn's comment and the discussion that followed. So thank you very much. And I'd like to ask all of you to join us for a reception. It's just down the hall, the mezzanine, and everyone is welcome to join and to continue the conversation. So thank you very much.
That was a good discussion.